the ground quickly enough to be able to prevent the violence from happening. And this is the argument that's been made by a couple of scholars in prominent outlets like Foreign Affairs. And not only that, but they go further, and they say that intervention, humanitarian intervention, is problematic because it encourages rebel groups to engage in highly risky behavior. The rebel group in this case, for example, being the Rwandan Patriotic Front. To engage in risky behavior, thinking that the international community will come to the rescue. Because they know that if we intervene, it's a moral hazard argument that we will come to the rescue. So humanitarian intervention, even if there's the political will, and even if it's practically feasible, is undesirable because it encourages risky rebellion that leads to the loss of life. Okay, what do I think about this argument? It's seductive. The logic is seductive. And there isn't hard evidence to prove it one way or the other. The counterfactual is hard. We can't go back in time and be able to say what would have happened if we had the political will, would we be able to do this. But I will say this. I will say that there is some evidence that in places where there was still the symbolic presence of the international community. So there was a rump of a UN mission that was left in Rwanda after UNAMIR, the UN mission on the ground, was evacuated. It went from a troop strength of just over 2,500 to a lump size of about 450 on the ground. But there's some evidence to show that in those places where these UN blue helmets were posted, that the civilians under their protection remained protected. It's the safe haven argument. And for example, the central stadium in Rwanda, Stade Amahoro, where several thousands, if not tens of thousands of Tutsi civilians sought refuge, was protected by a very small number of UN peacekeepers. These stadiums existed in every single major town in Rwanda. Football stadiums, sports stadiums. It might have been possible to have deployed small numbers of UN peacekeepers to protect symbolically their presence there as the symbolic representatives of the international community, these communities in these places. Possibly. The counter-argument to that, of course, all of you will be aware, is Srebrenica, where we did have a Dutch-protected safe haven, but nonetheless, the Dutch peacekeepers, in the face of the Serbian military forces, laid down their weapons and a massacre ensued. It's not clear whether the same thing would have happened inside Rwanda. We do not know. But that's one. I would like to put out the safe haven argument out there to counter the argument about the speed of violence. The second is that if you look at the map of Rwanda and you look to see which parts of the country experience violence first and which parts of the country experience violence last, you will see quite clearly that there are two areas in the center and the south of the country which had a late onset of violence. In fact, for about 2 weeks, violence did not occur in Butare and, to a lesser extent, in Gitarama prefectures, as they were known back in 1994. This is in the south and the center of the country. The reasons for this are several, but the main reason is that in the case of Butare prefecture, the prefect, the head of this prefecture, was himself a Tutsi, and he resisted the orders that were coming from the new extremist government in the center, saying that you need to work and protect the country, which is the euphemism for exterminating the Tutsis. And he said, no, we're not going to do this. So he resisted. His resistance led to his murder and his replacement by another extremist. And once the civilian head fell, then Butare itself fell. But the point is that there was this window of about 2 weeks, when remember that in the first 2 weeks, this is when most of the violence took place, there was this window of about 2 weeks where there was a part of the country where violence was not taking place. I believe that if UN peacekeepers had been deployed to the south and the center of the country, in collaboration with the local communities who were already resistant to the forces of genocide, they were resisting the incursions from outside of their communities to come into the harm way coming into their communities, that this collaboration between UN peacekeepers and locally resistant communities might have been able to buy enough time to create a corridor for a good number of Rwanda's Tutsi population to escape over the border south into Burundi. But in the absence of UN peacekeepers, some did escape in those 2 weeks. And to put this into this context for you, Butare and Gitarama are home to the largest concentration of Tutsi in the country. And if you would also count the number of Tutsi refugees who sought protection in Butare and Gitarama because they knew that these were the 2 prefectures where violence had not yet happened, we would possibly save a good number more Tutsi civilians by buying them time to be able to get over the border into Burundi. So that's what I say to that.
Let me just say, maybe add one thing, which is, and I guess I'm more willing to blame than Omar is. And I think a lot of blame rests actually on the Belgian and on the Americans. Because what happened is very early, within a few days of the genocide, the Belgian peacekeepers, a number of Belgian peacekeepers were murdered, and Belgium pulled out all of its peacekeepers, and they were the backbone of the UN peacekeeping force. And they wanted cover for that, and they got cover for that from the United States, because the United States didn't want to commit, wasn't involved. And that's why you ended up with this rump UN peacekeeping mission. So I do think that there's a lot of blame. And again, as a number of scholars have argued, the scenes in which these peacekeepers were leaving, okay, particularly the Belgian peacekeepers and other peacekeepers were leaving, sent a signal to the extremists that nobody was going to stop them and that they could ramp up the violence. And as Omar is saying, there were divisions within the country, regional divisions, but also divisions within the Rwandan military. Some who were behind a genocidal policy and some who opposed it. And yet, the ones who opposed the genocide quickly lost the argument because the peacekeepers just practically evaporated overnight.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got another question for Lars. You've talked a lot about the illiberal peace in Rwanda, which came at the cost of internal repression and violence abroad, especially in Zaire, today the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Could you talk a bit more about the Rwandan government's involvement in the Congo wars? And could you maybe give a final assessment of whether we can still say that Rwanda is a success story or has been a success story politically and economically?
It's a really hard question. I mean, I think there's no question that it has been an economic success story. When you look at all the economic indicators, it looks good. Again, we have to then ask hard questions, as Omar has done, about the sustainability of that trajectory. But I think it's also important to realize that part of Rwanda's economic recovery and part of Rwanda's peace was paid for by Congo, right? It was paid for by the looting of Congo. And it was also paid for by keeping military people in Rwanda happy by being out there looting the Congo. Okay? It kept them quiescent. Okay, so that's one side of the story. I think, and this goes back to really what Omar talked about before, I think I think what's also interesting about President Kagame and his political party is that they do have very much a vision. And the vision is that they want to recreate Rwandan society from top to bottom. They want to recreate it politically, they want to recreate it administratively, they want to recreate it geographically, and they want to recreate it culturally. Okay? And they see this as a way to prevent future genocide. And so what that means is about re-educating the population. And they understand that that's going to take time. It may take one or more generations to do. And so their idea is to keep the lid on, to be fairly repressive, while at the same time delivering public goods, health, education, etc. to the population, and at the same time re-educating them. And it's a big gamble. So far, it's It's worked to the extent that there has been economic recovery, that there has been political stability, but I guess I really worry whether that is a model that can hold over the long term, and I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, just on the question about the narrative, the two narratives that we have about Rwanda. One is the happy success story. Here's a country which, on economic indicators, is doing very well. It's sustained GDP growth of about 6%. Poverty has declined. It appears inequality is declining. Vertical inequality is declining. The health indicators, the education indicators, all good. The other narrative, of course, is that Rwanda is a country in which the political space is getting increasingly small. Freedom of expression, human rights more generally are being abused, and specifically in Eastern Congo, Rwanda has seen this as its backyard and has operated with largely impunity in Eastern Congo. There is a relationship between these two issues, though, economic growth and Rwanda's behavior in Eastern Congo. As Lars just mentioned, that some of this economic prosperity, this growth, might well have been driven by the extraction of cassiterite and coltan from Eastern Congo and funneling through Rwandan companies, which are owned in part by the ruling party, that then appear on Rwanda's budget sheet. So when you look, we don't have hard data on this, but when I looked at this data myself a few years ago, the best approximation that we can come up with is that we look at the domestic production levels for, say, cassiterite and coltan for Rwanda from the US National Geographic Survey, and then I compare it to the export levels, how much cassiterite and coltan Rwanda is exporting to the world, and the discrepancy is some indication, a very rough approximation, possibly how much is coming from Eastern Congo. When I looked at those data, it doesn't actually seem very much, which makes me feel that there's a lot more that's going on beneath the books that we're not seeing, because it's certainly not anywhere close enough to be able to explain a GDP in the level of $5 billion per annum. But the economic growth success story isn't just about extraction from Congo, it's also about the aid industry.
Absolutely.
This is another very important source of revenue for the Rwandan government. Rwanda, before the genocide, was a highly aid-dependent country. After the genocide, it remains a highly aid-dependent country, with one crucial difference, which is that the aid community is extremely, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the World Bank, who are some of the largest supporters of material development assistance in the form of budgetary support, so giving cash to the budget balance sheet of the Rwandan government, and they have been reluctant to pull budgetary support for a couple of quite obvious reasons. One of which, of course, is that the RPF enjoy the distinction for having ended the genocide, so who are they to tell them what to do? And the other is a sense of guilt, that we did not act during the genocide, so who are we to tell these people what to do with their money? But the aid industry continues to play, I believe, quite an important role in providing not only the material support, but also the political and diplomatic support to the Rwandan government, and is partly the promoter of this alternative narrative that Rwanda is a country that is doing very well, and we should continue to support it as such.
Okay, thanks for your replies. Before we turn to the question and answer session, maybe just a final conclusion from both of you. If you had to sum up the effect of the Rwandan genocide on the international community, or basically on the attitude towards genocide in one sentence, what would that be? And would you say, regarding present violence and present conflict, that the lessons from the past have been learned? I know that's very difficult, but maybe just short.
One sentence, the responsibility to protect. I think people would say the same, right? That that's a norm that has emerged as one of the consequences of Rwanda's genocide. So now we don't think that humanitarian intervention is an infringement of a country's sovereignty, because sovereignty used to be a license to states to abuse their civilian population. Now we recognize that they have a duty, a responsibility to protect civilians. And even though that law may not be universally implemented, it still exists, and that's a step forward.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, and you can look at Central African Republic, right? You can argue that not enough is being done in Central African Republic, but a hell of a lot more is being done today in terms of Central African Republic than was ever done for Rwanda in 1994. So I think that is both moral and political progress. Is it enough? No. I guess, did you want to also address maybe in terms of, what was your second question, in terms of the future, in terms of, is there a possibility for violence? And I don't know what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a $64 million question. Would we ever see violence on the scale that we saw in 1994 in Rwanda? There are two images here. One is the pressure cooker image, that Rwanda, beneath the surface, there is this grievance, there is this accumulation of ethnic steam that we do not see because the ruling party has eliminated outdoor discussion or identification of ethnic lines. But nonetheless, there are these resentments bubbling and increasing below the surface. The other is that we live in some kind of post-ethnic utopia in Rwanda, where nobody identifies as Hutu or Tutsi or Twa any longer. Now we're all Rwandans, and we've put our ethnic differences behind us. Which image best describes Rwanda? To my mind, a little bit of both. I think that there are elements of Rwandan society which do genuinely feel these resentments: victor's justice, the lack of political exclusion, the de facto Tutsi ethnocracy and RPF ethnocracy of the country. But there's also a generation of Rwandans who are being born that have no direct knowledge of the genocide. And they're born into a country whose education system and whose history curriculum, for example, has been dictated, has been shaped by the Rwandan government. And they're presented with a particular portrait, not just in schools, but in the general public sphere, in the newspapers, on the radio stations. The messages that they're receiving are those that are provided, the narrative that are provided by the Rwandan government. So I wonder about this next generation, the post-genocide generation, how they see these issues, whether they see them differently to how their parents might have done.
I mean, I tend to think it's very unlikely that we'll get violence on the scale of 1994 ever again, and partly because the government has taken steps to prevent that through re-education of the population, but also through bringing refugees, Hutu refugees who fled, back inside the country where they can be more easily controlled. So I think that's part of the story. I think the other part of the story is that most of the ethnic violence in Rwanda is modern and it is state-incited and state-supported. So if you don't have the state encouraging ethnic violence, it's unlikely to happen, except on a very localized level. And so again, as long as the state is not, so the danger really in Rwanda is if at some point in the future, the RPF, the Tutsi minority elite fall, and there's a new government of Hutu that decides to take out